The moment that I see the very first orange-colored leaf hit the ground in the fall, I start humming one song to myself. And that is Into the Unknown by the Blasting Company, better known as the theme song to Over the Garden Wall. To me, it doesn't count as fall until I've given this series a rewatch. It's the perfect blend of levity and darkness, and the art, the music, and the scenery fills a niche in my imagination that no other art has quite managed to fill. This series is lightning in a very small bottle. It's a modern fairy tale that uses nostalgic motifs to tell a very original story, one that isn't just autumnal in its setting, but one that explores the autumn of all of our lives, the bone-deep discomfort that comes with change. By refusing to capitulate to the modern conception of the fairy tale, by embracing the unsettling liminality that comes with growing up, and by using the tools of its genre in very unique ways, Over the Garden Wall manages to make for the perfect modern fairy tale. And I may not be Cinderella, but I do love a perfectly fitted sock, which is why I'm so excited to tell you about this video's sponsor, Bombas. Look, we may have just started fall, but winter is on its way, and that means that I am going to be wearing socks all day every day for the next, 5 months. And fortunately, I'm going to have a good time with that this year, thanks to Bombas, who make the most comfortable socks in the history of feet. Bombas socks provide perfect arch compression without pinching my toes, and they have the perfect sock for every occasion. They have a great range of athletic and compression socks, and so many cute ones for more dressy outfits. And Bombas doesn't just make good socks, they are doing good in the world. For every item purchased, they donate an item to those in need. Socks, underwear, and t-shirts are the most requested items in homeless shelters, and Bombas has donated over 150 million of those items to those who need them. Bombas has a 100% happiness guarantee, meaning that you can return your items no matter the reason. They offer international shipping, and they carry everything from socks to shoes to shirts. So what are you waiting for? Feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing that your purchase is doing some real good. New customers can get 20% off their first purchase. Just go to bombas.com/Jess and use my code Jess at checkout. Thank you so much to Bombas for sponsoring this video, and thanks to you for checking out my sponsors. I just want to start this video out by saying that if you have not watched Over the Garden Wall, you should not watch this video. Instead, go and watch the series, and then come back and watch this video, because I'm going to be spoiling the entire thing, and I give you the Jess of the Shire guarantee that that series is absolutely worth watching. The whole thing comes in under 2 hours of total watch time, and it is the perfect series for this time of year. So go watch the series, but also, because I know that you're probably going to watch this video anyway, let me give you a little bit of context. Over the Garden Wall is a 10-episode miniseries that aired on the Cartoon Network across 5 nights of November 2014. These episodes are short, only around 11 minutes per episode, but they spin the tale of 2 lost boys in the woods, Greg and Wirt, who found themselves in a land called the Unknown. As the introductory narration describes,
somewhere lost in the clouded annals of history lies a place that few have seen. A mysterious place called the Unknown, where long-forgotten stories are revealed to those who travel through the wood.
The older of the two, Wirt, is an incredibly self-serious and brooding teenager who's nursing a broken heart, while his younger half-brother, Greg, is much more happy-go-lucky, and his main goal in life is to find the perfect name for his pet frog. As the boys try and find their way home, they stumble across many strange characters and places. They find the tortured woodsman, the talking bluebird Beatrice, the highwayman. They pass through Pottsfield, a village of skeletons that wear pumpkin suits to their fall festival, the school where they're trying to teach animals to read. They even hitch a ride on a steamboat full of frogs. But through it all, the boys are pursued by warnings about the Beast, a dark spirit that haunts the forest, preying on lost souls. Greg and Wirt muddle their way through the baffling world known as the Unknown, escaping danger, solving mysteries, and desperately trying to figure out the way home. Now, given everything that I just described there, you might be picturing something that's kind of like Alice in Wonderland meets New England Wizard of Oz. And you wouldn't be entirely off, because Over the Garden Wall is a fairy tale. It's just not a modern fairy tale. Fairy tales, fairy stories, and folk tales are in a really weird place these days. The rapid rise of mass global communication, the implementation of the printing press, and the tightening of copyright restrictions means that there has been a tectonic shift in the way that stories are remembered and told. Once upon a time, the oral tradition was the primary avenue for telling stories, sitting down with someone and telling them a story out loud. Stories were expected to change from one telling to another as details were forgotten or added, as characters were adjusted to better fit the audience who they were telling the story to. As folks like the Brothers Grimm would come to recognize, there were certain stories that became more popular and more ubiquitous, things like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, or stories about bears, but these stories were hardly consistent from one telling to another. In those days, it was expected that fairy tale motifs would get passed from one story to another. Just because there was an evil stepsister in the story of Cinderella didn't mean that you couldn't have an evil stepsister in another story, or in all of your stories. It was kind of treated like seasoning. Garlic powder tastes really good, and yes, it might belong to a certain recipe, but if it's good, why not add it to different recipes? So it is that back in the day, fairy tales maintained a certain fluidity that is very much missing from modern fairy tales. The printing press kind of started it all, because the printing press meant that you could spread one singular static version of a story. No longer were you sitting there trying to recall or retell a story. You could sit and read the exact same words off of a page every single night for someone's lifetime. Copyright also limited how much these stories could be proliferated, because now these stories belonged to one person. If you wanted to rewrite or retell this story, you would have to deal with the legalese and deal with the copyright holder. With the dawn of mass global communication through means like the internet, this problem has only exacerbated. The flexibility of stories now completely frozen, locked away in the hands of corporations who own these stories, such as Disney. Nowadays, if you say Cinderella, people have one particular image of Cinderella in mind. Stories like Snow White or Sleeping Beauty have a set story that most people would recognize, and deviations from that basic story would now be considered deviations, rather than just being a natural part of the storytelling process. These fairy tales have now been distilled into a single recognizable image, and any deviation from that norm requires the special demarcation of it being a retelling or a reimagining. Of course, there are plenty of stories that seek to subvert these fairy tale norms. Shrek, Hoodwinked, Ella Enchanted, and so many more take the familiar tropes of fairy tales and turn them on their heads, spoofing them, satirizing them, and using them to tell a new story. But I find that often these retellings only serve to reinforce the ways in which these tropes belong to the stories that they belong to. The princess might kick ass now, but she's still gonna get married to a prince figure at the end of the story. Little Red Riding Hood might wear jeans now, but she's still going to be dealing with the wolf in the dark wood. Even the most imaginative of modern fairy tale retellings are still taking an old story and giving it a fresh twist. But what Over the Garden Wall does is that it creates a fresh story with an old twist. Many of the fairy tale motifs present in Over the Garden Wall are completely removed from their standard context. We can see the puzzle pieces that they borrowed from traditional fairy tale narratives, but they're in a completely new and unfamiliar puzzle. In the first episode, Greg and Wirt leave a trail of candy like Hansel and Gretel, but it's certainly not a witch's cabin that they stumble across. They're crossing the River of the Dead on a ferry, but it's certainly not like any ferry I remember from Greek myth. There's a servant girl, Lorna, who's overworked by her evil aunt, but this is no Cinderella story. As Christina Wilsey puts it, decontextualizing motifs from familiar narrative arcs and their burden of associations, Over the Garden Wall is free to break fairy tales down to their constituent elements and assemble a new story. And they keep the story feeling fresh by throwing in a lot of motifs and imagery that aren't familiar to us. In the behind-the-scenes mini-documentary, the show's creator Patrick McHale mentions that Over the Garden Wall came from a place of things that had been lost. So old stories that never existed, but were sort of pretending once existed. The end result feels like looking through a mirror into a different world. The imagery and folklore are familiar, but they're completely unmoored. It's intriguing and off-putting all at once, and it shakes loose the modern fairy tale sensibility and returns the art of storytelling to a time long ago, when stories were much more fluid, much more ambiguous creatures. And not only were the motifs of the old fairy tale far less stable, but the morality of these stories was also far more changeable than I think people realize. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because these fairy tales have stood the test of time, while the moral standards and moral beliefs of the culture have not stayed quite as stable. So a story like Little Red Riding Hood, when it was first being told in like 1704, the message of that story, the main message they were trying to teach, was to keep kids from wandering off into the woods where they might be killed by a wolf. Now, in more modern eras, that's not as much of an issue. We don't send our children into the dark woods, and there are far less wolves around. So the moral of the story has changed in modern days to be more along the lines of listen to your parents. In even more contemporary adaptations of the story, there's probably a little bit of more modern ideas sprinkled in there, such as trust yourself, believe in yourself, the kind of morals that end up in a lot of modern fairy tales. The point is that the message of fairy tales has never been a particularly static thing until nowadays, when there is now a predominant version of the story from which all other iterations of the story descend. But considering the changeability of the morals of these stories opens up the question, how important is the moral to the story? I'm sure we've all heard the idea that fairy tales originated as a way to teach kids lessons in a way that they would find digestible. But why then has the story remained far more consistent across time than the moral? Why is it that the imagery is what we remember from these fairy tales before we remember the lessons that they taught us? The torn red cloak sitting on the forest floor, the glass slipper on the stairs, the vast castles, the enchanting libraries, the yellow brick roads. You have to ask yourself, is it the point of a fairy tale to teach a lesson or to tell a story? Is the goal of a fairy tale to tell a story wrapped in the sugar-sweet coating of a narrative, or is the narrative disguised as a lesson in order to slip it under the door into children's education? Over the Garden Wall recognizes the changeability of a story's morals and refuses to tell you what exactly the story means. Here's another quote from Christiana Wilsey. The elusive, undetermined morals of Over the Garden Wall allow viewers breathing room to experience the fairy tale on their own terms, rather than being instructed in how to read or use it. Ultimately, the miniseries reminds us that fairy tales do not mean anything on their own. Throughout this story, Greg and Wirt learn a lot about who they are and the world that they live in. But they don't learn that because at the end of every episode, somebody sits them down and says, well, this is the lesson that you're supposed to have learned today. In fact, a lot of their frustration stems from the fact that they are struggling to discern what it is that they're meant to learn from the experiences that they're having. And even when they are directly given advice, they struggle to accept it. The woodsman directly tells them to take better care of each other, and they brush him off. At one point, Wirt is put in front of a room and told that he needs to sing a song about who he is, where he's going, and why he's there, and he completely struggles to find his identity. And in the end, the people just send him out the door, telling him to follow his heart. No matter how many times they ask for directions, no one can set them on the path that they seek. When they stumble across poor Lorna in the woods working for her monstrous aunt, it turns out that Lorna was the monster all along, as Greg helpfully points out.
Oh, for some reason I thought that old lady was the people eater, but it was Lorna all along. It just goes to show you stuff.
And it does in fact go to show you stuff. He can't specify what that stuff is because he doesn't know. That's going to be different for every person. Over the Garden Wall has zero interest in sending you home with an exact recipe on how to live your life. Rather, Over the Garden Wall wants to encourage you to work for these lessons, to look deeper into the everyday confusing experiences and figure out how you, on an individual level, can grow from that experience. And in doing this, the lessons that Over the Garden Wall has to teach become far more universal, because a child can watch this show and get something completely different out of it than I would get out of watching it. The ambiguity of this story lends itself to much more flexibility. The flexibility that originally made fairy tales so special, so valuable, and so beloved. But there are some specific lessons that Greg and Wirt learn in the unknown, and perhaps one of the most significant ones is not to trust in fairy tales. Time and time again, the assumptions that Greg and Wirt make based off of the fairy tale logic that they know from stories ends up putting them in serious trouble. The trail of candy leads the wild dog right to them. Beatrice, the helpful animal guide, is not leading them to a wizard who can help them get home. She's leading them to be enslaved. Greg isn't going to be saved from the beast because he's played his game and solved his riddles. He's just going to end up more tired and dead. But this also forces the audience to reconsider everything. We're put in a place where our meta-knowledge of stories and fairy tales won't help us through the unknown. Rather, like Wirt and Greg, we have to learn the importance of critical thinking, of using our eyes to genuinely look at what is going on in front of us. This is something that is far easier for Greg to master. As the younger of the two, and someone who just automatically doesn't have as much know-how about the world, Greg is much more willing to accept the confusion of the unknown. But Wirt, who's so much older and wiser than his brother, has a lot of trouble accepting what's happening in the unknown. When he literally sees and hears Beatrice the Bluebird talking to him, he says,
A bird's brain isn't big enough for cognizant speech.
Hey, what was that?
I mean, I'm just saying, you're weird. Like, not normal. I mean, oh my gosh, stop talking to it, Word.
There is literally a bird talking to him at this point. What is technically possible, according to the laws of science, doesn't really matter here, because there is something happening in front of him that he needs to contend with. Throughout the story, Wirt's presumptions about the world keep him from taking the unknown for what it is, for what is actively in front of him. And when all hope seems gone, it's this inability to roll with the punches that nearly gets him and Greg killed. Without a logical or reasonable way forward, Wirt gives up. It isn't until he reaches the point of crisis, the point of his brother being gone, that he realizes that he needs to throw away everything that he knows about the world and start to think critically about what is actually in front of him. He needs to look with both of his eyes at what's really there. Yes, it seems ridiculous and illogical and strange, but the same can be said about the real world a lot of the time. If we allow ourselves to get lost in what should happen, in what we think the world should be, we lose grasp of what actually is. And that's not to say that we all need to be Greg. Greg himself is far from perfect. He makes a lot of decisions that do get them into trouble. He doesn't listen to his brother. He overall needs to learn to be a bit more aware of his surroundings, to think more critically. Both Wirt and Greg need to grow up in this way, but their journeys are not identical. And I think that this is part of the efforts from Over the Garden Wall to keep things from feeling too simple. Every person, depending on where they're coming from and where they're going, is going to have a different journey into adulthood. But it is by learning this lesson that the boys are able to go home. They're able to see through the lies of the beast, and by employing their new critical thinking and by taking responsibility for their own paths, Wirt and Greg earn their passage home. All of the unknown is designed not just to keep Wirt and Greg on their toes, but the audience as well. And one of the major ways they're able to do this is through the late reveal of the frame narrative. The unknown is a secondary world. It is a world that exists in conjunction and in relation in some way to our primary real world. On a scale from Middle-earth to Narnia, Over the Garden Wall is much more in the direction of Narnia. There is a real world that certain characters are coming from into this fantasy world. But you don't find out that the unknown is a secondary world rather than a primary world until episode 9. We first enter over the garden wall in media res, already within the unknown, with no real reason to believe that these children came from our world. This fact is hinted at here and there throughout the story, as Wirt is looking around for a telephone or talking about the brain size of a bluebird, but it isn't confirmed that Wirt and Greg are from our real primary world until the penultimate episode of the series. In this episode, we are launched into the relatively modern day, as Wirt and Greg get themselves ready for Halloween night, donning the costumes that they wear throughout the series. It turns out that the girl that Wirt has been yearning after through the entire series is actually just his high school crush. Wirt is trying to confess his love through the form of a mixtape, but then he finds out that this girl is about to be asked out by Jason Funderburker, a boy who is the total package, and so Wirt loses his courage. But it's too late. Greg has already given her the mixtape, and in their effort to reclaim it, Greg and Wirt jump over a cemetery wall, are nearly hit by a train, and fall into a frozen river. They wake up and find themselves in the unknown, lost in the dark wood. Now, what's interesting is that the original plan for the series would have had this episode being the first one. It would have made sense chronologically. But the problem is that having this episode first would have completely changed the audience's perception of the unknown. Rather than taking it at face value for its own merit, there would have been an instinct to try and figure out what the unknown is. Is it a portal fantasy? Is the unknown the underworld, or purgatory, or hell, or maybe a shared hallucination? We would naturally begin to moralize, to draw parallels, to try and figure out how this fantasy can be nothing more than mere fantasy. A perhaps educational, but ultimately dreamlike, unimportant mirage of the real world. But they decided to save this reveal for the end, meaning that the audience is forced to contend with the unknown in a much more serious and much more earnest way, just like Greg and Wirt. Because the unknown is truly a place that defies all categorization. There have been so many articles and think pieces and video essays trying to narrow in on what exactly the unknown is, to find an explanation for what it is in relation to our real world, but I've found that none of these are particularly satisfying. Yes, you could make the purgatory argument. You could claim that everyone in the unknown is a lost soul, and they are being tested to see if they're ready to go to heaven, but why then, when the story ends and many of these characters have redeemed themselves, do they show a montage of them all still in the unknown? You could claim that this is hell, that this is a making of the beast, who is a Satan figure, to trap all of these souls for his means, but that doesn't explain why the unknown continues to persist after he has been destroyed. You could go with the shared hallucination theory, but first off, I don't really think that's how shared hallucinations work. And secondly, how would you explain that the name of the character Quincy Endicott from Within the Unknown is on one of the gravestones outside of the unknown? And even if you want to claim that at some point Greg and Wirt had read those gravestones and so those names were just subconsciously within their minds, that doesn't explain Jason Funderburker. The frog, not the boy. Because Jason Funderburker, the frog, came with them into the unknown, was in the unknown, and then came out, which is fine. Maybe he was just part of that shared hallucination, except that it's revealed that Jason Funderburker, who swallowed the bell in Lorna's house, still has the bell inside his stomach, even long after they've left the unknown. There is no single satisfying explanation for this other world. Maybe there's one out there that I just haven't found, but I've got the feeling that there is no singular, simple explanation for this other world. There are aspects of it that are very unreal and very dreamlike. You have the one-room schoolhouse suddenly becoming a dining hall, and then an orphanage when it's convenient, like our dreams so often trip up where exactly we are and what those places contain. But there's also things that happen in the unknown that are very real, that are life or death. The unknown cannot be pinned down or explained. It remains very stubbornly, unknown, which is really unique in a world that loves to shred apart every story into its component parts and explain everything away. Over the Garden Wall very intentionally avoids clarity and definition. It is a frame narrative that at first refuses to tell you that it's a frame narrative, and then refuses to tell you what exactly is within the frame, or where the frame is, or what the frame consists of. And this infuses every aspect of the story. This is especially present in the visuals. The backgrounds are lush and autumnal, inspired by romantic art of the last 2 centuries, and yet atop this traditional backdrop is quite modern animation. It continues to defy expectations. The theming of this art as well, this kind of northeastern Americana Thanksgiving vibe, was also particularly chosen to be confusing, especially for an American audience that is very familiar with this imagery. As Kayla Justice says, Over the Garden Wall takes place not in a fantastic, unrecognizable other world, but rather in our own backyard. That is, New England. The familiarity of the otherworld landscape further complicates an already complicated environment for the protagonist, as well as, and perhaps more so, for the spectators. Like a robot that's made to look just a little bit too human, the unknown slips right into the uncanny valley. The beautifully composed music tickles your ear with songs that feel like you almost remember them, but not quite. The fairy tale tropes feel familiar, but are technically alien. It's kind of like coming home to Thanksgiving dinner, and you look around the table at everyone you've known your whole life, and all of their noses are wrong. It's not like atrocious, it's not even wrong per se, but something is off. It's not quite what you remember. It's like when you first see the trees of winter, stripped back from the lushness of summer. It's natural, but it's strange. This uncomfortable tension between familiar and unfamiliar is further pushed by the way that Over the Garden Wall references other media. Much has been written about how jam-packed Over the Garden Wall is with references, both textually and visually. The background art is clearly inspired by 19th and 20th century romantic scenery art, especially the Hudson River School's rich landscapes. We see early Disney references with the dancing skeletons and Alice's Wonderland. There's a character clearly modeled after Betty Boop. Episode 8 is entitled Babes in the Woods, which is also the name of a folk tale about 2 children who are lost in the forest and die of hypothermia before being covered with leaves by birds. And this is the episode where, while taking a nap under a pile of leaves, Greg and Wirt almost freeze to death. And as many people have noted, this story definitely contains parallels to Dante's Inferno. Dante and Wirt both wear red caps and are often depicted with cloaks. Both of them are in love with a woman, and both of them write sad poetry. Even Dante's eventual guide is named Beatrice, just as Wirt and Greg are led through the dark wood by someone named Beatrice. But Over the Garden Wall is distinctly not a retelling of Dante's Inferno. It is not a rewrite of an old folk tale, it's not an extended Disney reference. The Betty Boop character is not in herself actually Betty Boop. These things are motifs. They're interesting to note, and they add to the intertextuality, but they are not some quick or easy way to understand or solve the story. This is a story that makes liberal use of familiar material, both real and fictional, but refuses to surrender to the form, shape, or messaging or context of those stories. It demands to be examined on its own merits, its own discoveries, and its own storytelling gravitas. There are quite a few stories out there that, if they don't have the struts of other stories, other contexts, and other history around them to support the story, they completely fall apart. And this is not one of those stories. Rather, these references almost act as a trap, as red herrings, drawing the audience into reference chase and draw up parallels, and leaving them just as turned around and lost as Greg and Wirt. This is a story that seeks to challenge not just its characters, not even just its audience, but the art of storytelling itself. It lashes out against the constraints of the modern fairy tale landscape. It uses every tool in the book to utterly disorient just as it enchants, begging you to figure out how to think for yourself. This is an absolutely original story that roots itself in the annals of a long, complex, and storied tradition. It's a willful playfulness, a determination to use old tools to tell new stories, without being chained down by the context that those tools originally arose from. I almost find it bizarre how good this story manages to be. First off, it is a mini-series, which is already not a particularly popular format, and it's animation, which I adore, but I know that a lot of people see as a less valuable form of storytelling, and it is a fairy tale, which is an oft looked down upon style of storytelling. In our modern world of franchises, reboots, and spin-offs, this is a story that dares to begin and to end, which is quite revolutionary nowadays. It is tight, self-contained, and bite-sized, but that is a deeply nourishing bite. It's a modern fairy tale not because it's a new twist on an old classic, but because it's a new classic with an old twist. A contemporary fairy tale for a new generation. It does what all the very best stories of this kind should endeavor to do. It breaks you down into parts, and then urges you to figure out how those parts should fit back together again. If you couldn't tell, I absolutely adore this story, and while this was already a not short video, I still have so much more to say about this series, so I am considering doing either videos about this or having it be involved in other videos talking about things, so if you have any interest in videos like that, be sure to let me know in the comments. Also in the comments, if you've seen the show, let me know what your favorite episode is, because I think that says a lot about you. And if you haven't watched this show, go and watch it right now. That is your homework, and then report back to the comments to let me know what you think. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and consider sending it to a friend who also likes Over the Garden Wall, and consider subscribing if you want to tune in every week to hear me talking about the art of storytelling, The Lord of the Rings, and the other stuff that I like to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.